I'm going to do the introduction for these chaps because I know them better than most people. I've known Al for 40 years now. Jeff's a fairly recent addition to our group here in the Toronto area. Al Collins, you've already met. He is the founder of Mount Albert Scale Lumber and now the owner of Ultimation Tools, a company that makes a great sander, and they've got a new slicing machine coming up very, very soon. And Al's also a very meticulous modeler. It does beautiful work. You've also seen his clinic on working with weathering wood. Jeff Millman was here last month, lives about an hour from where I am, and has a combination O standard gauge and new narrow gauge ON3 layout that he is just building. It's going to be dead rail, power on board, and doing some really quick and amazingly quick and accurate, excellent work. So, gentlemen, it's
the title of our clinic tonight is Notes from a Reluctant Brass Painter. So that would be me, and I really appreciate Al Collins' participation and help putting all this together. So a bit of an outline for our presentation. We'll cover the objective. I'll go over cleaning and preparing brass for paint, and then Al will take over, do a bit of a shop talk, and do some discussion about airbrushing essentials, airbrush cleaning. I'll cover off with paints, and then we'll flash up some pictures of some painted models at the end. So objective. Our objective is to help fine scale modelers get comfortable with using an airbrush and with painting brass models. First part of cleaning and preparing a model for paint after it's all built and ready to go is to take it apart. So it kind of comes apart in two broad categories. One category is the all brass superstructures, where it's just soldered brass components. And the other broad category are trucks and running gear and that kind of thing. So the distinction being that the trucks and the running gear, they have to have a little bit of extra tender loving care because of plastic insulating materials, delicate bearing surfaces in the motor, and so on. Whereas the all brass superstructure components can be subject to all manner of indignity. They can be dunked and blasted and all kinds of great stuff. Just a final note on factory varnish. It can be tempting to paint over top of a factory varnish, but it's often not tightly adhering. There's often oxides forming underneath. It really should be removed for a good paint job in most instances. So first step, getting rid of varnish or original paint that might be on the model. What I do is for the superstructure assemblies, the all brass assemblies, I submerge them in a soup can filled with lacquer thinner for a few days. You can see that in the image on the right-hand side. Cover it up with a bit of tin foil and tape to minimize evaporation. Put it in the garage, a shed, on the back porch, well away from any sources of ignition. After 24 hours or more, scrub them with a small stiff brush. This will eliminate the varnish and probably most of the paint. Paint can be a little bit more stubborn. I often finish off with a strong furniture stripper. You want to find one that contains methylene chloride. That's the good stuff. That'll strip the paint off really well. Just a word of caution, use that only outdoors, and always wear hand and eye protection. That's a very nasty chemical. The other category, the running gear and the trucks, just a quick note here, I don't disassemble the drive mechanism for painting, especially complex drive mechanisms. What I do is suspend them over a glass tray, use some lacquer thinner and a stiff brush, and scrub off the varnish and or the original paint if it's already a painted model. Then the next step is to mask all of the delicate running gear components in the motor, as shown in the image on the right-hand side, and use an air eraser just to prep the surface of the cylinder assembly, the front pilot, and the rear frame. Those are the touch points that you touch when you pick the model up. So you want the paint to stick to those areas really, really well. So what's an area eraser? For anybody who's not familiar, that image there is of a Pache air eraser. It looks very much like an airbrush, but it's basically a miniature sandblaster. And there is a purpose-built grit, aluminum oxide grit that goes with it. It's great for removing paint, for preparing surfaces that paint won't otherwise stick to, like raw brass or Delrin. And it will clean up solder smears on brass models. As Al will talk about later on, you have to have a very moisture-free air supply. And just a word of recommendation, I don't reuse the blast compound. Once through and out it goes. It's not very expensive. So now we're at the point where we need to degrease the superstructure components. I give them 10 minutes at 50 degrees Celsius with a good dash of Dawn dishwashing detergent in an ultrasonic cleaner. That will also get rid of any flux residue, and just a word of caution, it will also find any weak solder joints. It's a good idea to look in the bottom of the ultrasonic cleaner for any loose bits once you've ultrasonically cleaned it. Next step, once the model is degreased, is to do kind of a bulk deoxidization of the superstructure. Again, 10 minutes in the ultrasonic cleaner with a diluted brass cleaning solution, Frankfurt Arsenal in this case. You can get that on Amazon. The image at the bottom shows a before image. That's kind of a typical dirty oxidized brass model. And afterwards, you can see a lot of the bulk oxides have been cleaned off the model. It's not quite ready for paint yet. Paint won't stick to that surface really well. A final step before painting that I do is to do a mild acid etch of the model. What you're looking for is a satiny kind of toothy finish that the paint will stick to really, really well. There's many mild acids out there. I've had good luck with photographic tray cleaner. I would recommend buying yourself a couple of O-gauge brass hopper car hulks at a model train sale. You can pick them up for about 20 bucks. Those are good test articles to test the strength of the acid solutions you're planning on using. Just a word of caution, when you dilute acid, always dilute acids by adding them to water, not water to the acid. That's to avoid exothermic reaction. If you're not comfortable using acids, you can clean the whole thing with an air eraser as a good alternate and have a surface the paint will stick to really, really well. So that's kind of getting brass cleaned and ready for paint. Al, if we can hear you, we'll go over to you for shop talk.
I'm here.
Excellent.
Well, good.
Thanks,
my
little
Jeff.
red dots here too.
And I'd be lost without the red dot. Excellent prep work, Jeff. Amazes me in how short a period of time you can take a somewhat derelict locomotive and make it look almost new. Painting has always been a bit of a black art for me. I have two hobbies. My second hobby is I build street rods, and I managed to master any welding or mechanical parts, and I couldn't afford to pay a painter. And so a lot of it just sat and rusted because I was afraid to paint it. And same with a lot of models. I build models over there and put them in a box because I'm afraid to paint them. So I figured it's about time I learned how to paint. So I actually took a year night course at a local college. It was for automotive painting. And I talked my way into a DuPont factory course. It's the same, whether you're painting a car or a model locomotive, it's just thinner, finer paint and smaller equipment. So the principles are pretty much the same. So if we look at some of the basics here in this slide, you need a spray booth, some way of venting the fumes. A lot of the newer paint, even the older paint, Flocal, for an example, was terrible. But a lot of the newer paints are lacquer based. They do a really nice job. But you're not going to be very popular if you stink up the house spraying lacquer. So a spray booth is important, with an excellent vent system to the outside, of course, well lit and at a comfortable height. I know Jeff's spray booth is, he likes to work standing up. There's no point starting to paint a model and find halfway through that you can't finish painting it because you can't get at what you want to paint. So a turntable is excellent, a well lit and a well ventilated area. Equipment is always important. A lot of the guys in our group use Grex pistol grip guns. I particularly like this. I never could master the double action, finger over the top gun. Not coordinated enough for that. It's an investment well worth. You buy it once and it'll last you forever. Next slide, Jeff. No matter what you're painting, you're spraying, air is the essential. There's a couple of things that are important. It's always a good idea to spray from a tank. They call it a receiver. You get a constant pressure, a constant air supply. You get no pulsation, no chance of pressure variation. So my recommendation is to Home Depot or Lowe's or big hardware outlet. You can find compressors, small industrial type compressors, $150, $160 range that are reasonably quiet, and they have a tank or a receiver so that you're drawing your air from the receiver. The regulator, of course, you need to be able to regulate the air pressure. If you do a lot of airbrushing, it's worth looking into the regulator that goes by the gun. So you regulate the air just before it goes into the airbrush. You get a much more accurate pressure sense by doing it that way. Not necessary, but it's a nice thing to have. My personal preference, I have my own compressor. It's 120 gallon with a 15 horsepower compressor. It's obviously that's tongue in cheek. That just happens to be in my shop. Jeff mentioned moisture. A lot of guys that I've come across don't like using air erasers because they bung up. A very small orifice, very fine compound. If you don't have completely dry air, they will do that. If you don't have completely dry air in your painting, you'll also have a problem. So a good moisture trap is essential. Next. Next slide, Jeff, please. So some very basics in spray painting. A lot of the paints we use, especially the acrylics and the water-based, dry very quickly. Some of them even dry right in the gun. You can see in these pictures, if we get our little bouncing red ball going here, if we look at this picture in the left, this is just a shot of paint. You can see in the center, there's paint, and then all around the periphery, there's dried paint or spatter. And that's basically paint that is in the periphery of the spray pattern. It's drying on contact and it's not sticking properly and it's not giving a smooth surface. If we move our bouncing red ball to the right side of the picture, you can see it is very dramatized here but you can see along that blue line where the actual paint stops and the overspray starts. So it takes practice, but what you want to do is take that wet edge, that wet section of the paint, and move it back and forth in your spray pattern, but move it down the work surface. So in each pass, each subsequent pass, you're moving that wet edge. You're traveling that wet edge back and, yes, good. Where'd my ball? There it is. And that's what you want to do. Otherwise, you get inconsistent finish. You get that rough, pebbly finish because the paint is dry. It's not flowing together. That's what you want to accomplish. It will take a bit of practice. So a few pointers on how to attain that is next picture, Jeff. Next picture, please, Jeff.
Yeah, maybe just a bit of a delay here, Al.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, so first thing is keep the distance between the spray gun and the work surface equal. 4 inches is a good starting point for a 0.3 millimeter spray gun, and any model paint that you're using sprays equally, well, roughly the same. So a 4 inch is a good starting point. Try and maintain that distance to keep the same paint buildup as you go. Next.
Yep, just hit the next slide.
So this is a little bit of a dramatization, but again, if we follow the red bouncing dot, there's a tendency to wave an airbrush around for beginners. Very easy to overcome. You can see that if you move the gun in an arc instead of moving it and keeping the distance the same, you will get a different paint buildup as you're painting along. And again, on the periphery, the paint dries before it hits the surface. And that's when you end up with that pebbly surface that you can get on some models. So if we go to the next slide. So if we start over at the right-hand side, keeping that 4-inch distance, now you want to keep the spray gun perpendicular and vertical to the paint surface. So if you look at the paint as a fan, as a wall of paint, for lack of a better term, you want it consistent in distance and the same 90-degree intercept angle, if you like, as it contacts the model. So if you follow the red ball, you want to start painting before you get onto the surface. That eliminates the potential for spatters, and you don't get a dry spot right off the bat. You work all the way across as the red dot goes. You go off the model and you release the trigger. You start the trigger again and you come back, and in each subsequent pass, you're moving down the surface. So you've got that wet edge that we talked about earlier, and you're taking that wet edge down the surface. Each consistent pass is the same distance away and the same angle, so it's the same potential. You get potentially the same thickness of paint on each pass as you go down the model. Next question, or sorry, next question, that's later. Next picture.
Yep.
So those are very basics. Now you have to try to put it into practice. Dollar store, for a couple of bucks, you can buy all the spoons you want. That big punch bowl spoon was $1, and you can practice that technique, but you're going to do it on a curved surface. You can do it on a convex surface. You can do it on a concave surface. You can spray the edges, so you get the idea of not building up too much thickness by doing the edges as opposed to the flat surfaces. The blue bin is an excellent source. There's all kinds of stuff in there that you can practice painting. Jeff's favorite thing is just go to a flea market type train show, pick up a box, some $2 box cars, and practice. And if you have an air eraser, you can practice more because you can erase. Next.
Yep.
Just as a little anecdote, it's funny, I want to learn how to TIG weld, and I met a guy that did some videos. I met him at a car show, and I said, I've watched all your videos and I'm teaching myself to weld. And he said, okay, you go home and practice for 2,000 hours and give me a call, see how you're making out. So that was the secret. I was afraid of airbrushing, and I just started practicing and making a mess, and now it's not so bad. The cleaning, I won't belay cleaning. You don't need to take your airbrush apart every time you clean it. If you wash it out right after you use it, I've got a Grexa for 2 years. I've never taken it apart. I can clean it just by spraying the thinners through it and backwashing it just by holding something over the nozzle and pulling, getting the fluid running backwards to back flush the needle. This Armor All glass cleaner is excellent for thinning acrylic paints, water-based paints. It's an excellent cleaner. I've seen articles where people have said use Windex to thin paint. Word of caution, Windex contains ammonia. A lot of airbrushes have brass internal pieces, and ammonia destroys brass. So I would not suggest using Windex to clean your airbrush or thin your paint. This particular Armor All one is almost exactly the same formula as acrylic paint thinner. Next picture. There's a whole whack of new paints on the market. We can thank the military modelers and the gamers for this. They are leaps and bounds ahead of the model railway as far as painting goes. I won't, I'll let Jeff take over in here. Most of them, there's new lacquer base. Tamiya's come out with a new line of lacquer base to compete with Mr. Hobby and AK. They spray beautifully, but they stink. So be aware of that. These third generation acrylics are amazing, both brush and spray. I don't know what they use for a carrier, but they are really nice paints. Jeff has just finished painting a whole slew of locomotives, so I'll pass it over to him.
All right.
He can talk a little bit. Take it away, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Al. And I really want to make a shout out to Al about doing all the research on these paints. I feel very much like I've ridden on his coattails in terms of paint selection. Mr. Finishing Surfacer, the 1500 black is excellent for priming brass models. It's actually also good for a finished paint color. Often I will put a very light top coat, maybe a charcoal gray, and I've used AK for that, but I think Tamiya would work just as well. The Mr. Color Leveling Thinner is an excellent thinner. It contains a retarder that slows the drying and really helps in maintaining the wet edge that Al was talking about. In fact, to the point where if you get a run, you can turn the air on and you can kind of blow that run out of the paint. Really good stuff. And just another addition on this third generation AK acrylics. Excellent paints for painting small details. It also seems to stick to Delrin, which almost no other paints do. So anyhow, then the thing I like about all these paints is they're readily available from the military modeling crowd. There's no toluene and no xylene in any of these paints. So I find those objectionable chemicals, and these are nice to use in that regard. So here's a couple of models just primed with the Mr. Finishing primer. A good surface for doing a top coat, or good as a finished surface. It'll take weathering, and you kind of have options. Here's another model with a NATO black top coat. Just a word about painting mechanisms. For fairly complex mechanisms with an external Walschaerts valve gear, inside frame, lots and lots of bits, this model even has full equalization. It would be a very brave thing to do to take that apart. So I don't. I just hook leads up, power leads up to the motor, run it slowly, and use a very fine mist and paint the mechanism without taking it apart. There in the image there, I'm using Q-tips soaked in lacquer thinner to clean off the tires. And then I only do a top coat sort of in front of the cylinders, or the cylinders and the pilot in front. The rest of it I just leave in the primed condition. Just a quote from Craig Symington from the January-February 21 Gazette. By far the most frustrating and challenging part of brass bashing is getting the model to run again after it's been painted, and I can certainly attest to that. Just another picture of a painted model. This was our subject model from earlier, and some more painted stuff. While you're at this stage, it's also a good idea to weather the cab interior. Not that anybody can ever see the cab interior, but now's the time. So this is the end of our presentation. I'll just leave up a list of references for people to look at, and if there's any questions.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hey guys. Oh, sorry, this is Keith, Jerry. One thing that Al didn't mention is the working pressure for the airbrush and the sandblaster. Might be a good idea to just talk about those a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I know I left that out. 18 to 20 PSI is a good work. It's a good starting point, Keith. And then you can, it's kind of a personal preference. That's why I go back to, I like that little adjustment, because the pressure varies depending on what you're doing. And I purposely left that out, hoping that someone would ask the question so that I could say that. 18 to 20 is a good starting point. Sorry?
I said, I would.
Well, there you go. You're my mate, right? So, I mean, if you're spraying, if you're trying, you can actually take a 0.2 millimeter airbrush and spray an eyeball. But you're going to run the thinness of you're going to thin the paint right down, and you're going to cut the pressure way down. So it varies. If you're using a fan cap, for example, and you're painting an O-scale boxcar, I didn't go into fan caps. That's a whole different project or topic. But a large area or a larger needle, you're going to use more pressure because you're going to use more paint. So as far as the air eraser goes, 40, 50 PSI is lots. Anything more than that. Actually, there's a misconception about sandblasting or air erasing. The more pressure is not the better, because all this stuff is all the aggregates are manufactured. They have little sharp edges on them. If you put too much pressure, you smash the edges off. It doesn't work nearly as well. So adequate pressure is more than enough.
Okay. So there's a question here. Thanks for that. There's a question here from Steve. He's asking, I assume you don't mask any of the moving parts. What about the necessary oils? I'm assuming he's talking about lubrication oil on the moving parts in the model.
Yeah, I take all of the lubrication off with the paint and the varnish during the initial lacquer thinner clean down. You want to get it to as dry and bare a brass condition as possible, and then mask all of the moving parts and air erase the cylinder sides, the front pilot, the rear frame. And then, of course, all the masking comes off. I usually give it another brush down with lacquer thinner to get any grit off of it. And then you're essentially running the locomotive or running the mechanism with no lubricant on it, but you're doing it for a short period of time while you're spraying the mechanism. Doesn't seem to be a problem. Then once the paint has cured, you can go back with a very fine oiler and reestablish all the lubrication at the bearing points, run it a little bit to get the gunk out of it, and then it seems to run fine.
Yeah, I imagine it's a good technique not to forget to do that part. Go back and do the lubricating before you put the locomotive on the track and try to test run it.
Yeah,
Mike is asking.
The locomotive will tell you if you forget.
It'll tell you. Yeah. Mike is asking, what grit of carbide grit do you use?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's just the standard Pache grit. I don't know that there's more than one of them. Al, do you know?
You know what? You caught us with our pants down. There's two.
So which one do I have, Al?
You know what? I will excuse myself and I'll be back, because I have both and I just forget what grit they are.
Thanks.
Don't go away.
We'll be here. Jonathan is asking, do you bake the models in a low temp oven after painting?
No, I never do.
Okay. I know a lot of people done that. In fact, I've done that on brass models that I painted. I'm coming from the flow quill world, where I always found it was better to do that with flow quill. But of course, as you say, the paints have changed so much now that may be an unnecessary step now.
Yeah, the Mr. Finishing primer, once it has cured, is pretty robust. So I've just never felt the need to take that step. There's always the horror stories where somebody adjusts the oven on you, or Anyhow, I won't go into the horror stories.
Yeah, let's not go there.
Yeah.
Mike is asking, what pressure do you use for the air eraser?
Yeah, as Al was saying, it's really a function of how long your hose is and where you're measuring the pressure. I have quite a long hose because I actually do the air erasing out in the driveway. It's easier to clean up that way. So it's typically 50 PSI, but I've got a 20-foot long hose.
Right.
With a shorter hose, you probably would go for 40 PSI or something like that.
Okay. Scott and Charles are saying I use baking soda in the air eraser. Have you tried that?
I have never tried that. I've only used the Pache aluminum oxide grit. I think you can get it's about a five pound tub of it for less than $30.
Okay.
Delivered to your door by Amazon. So
the advantage of the baking soda is because when you're done cleaning your locomotive, you can make tea biscuits or something.
Muffins.
Jake is asking, where does one purchase AK products in Canada?
Depends on where you are in Canada.
Yeah.
I really like Wheels and Wings in Toronto.
Yeah.
There's a hobby shop, Forbes Hobbies, here in Cambridge that has it. Sunward Hobbies. Anywhere that specializes in military modeling, they'll have the whole AK line.
I believe Wheels and Wings has a fairly extensive mail order business as well. So if you can't get it where you're located in BC, you might lean on those guys.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, Dave Woodhead in Toronto is saying Sunward Hobbies is very good. Philip's comment is a Pache AEX5 is what I have. I'm assuming that's referring to an air eraser. Lori McLean is saying paint on the
back.
Yep.
Hello.
Hang on a sec. Lori McLean is saying paint on the driver bearings to frame will cause electrical conductive problems. So do you fit pickup wipers?
Yes. With power on board, that's just a problem that I fly over top of. Now, I know I actually remove all the pickup wipers on my locomotives. Keith Stamper uses that method and of not disassembling the locomotive mechanisms, and I think he's had pretty good success with not creating insulating conditions where they're not supposed to be.
Right. I'm assuming what would happen, what Lori's referring to, I'm assuming, is that paint might seep into the driver bearings, because theoretically they would be covered, right, by whatever's holding the bearing in, or the axle going through it. But yeah, I suppose it's possible you could get paint seeping in, and then you got something that's
It's possible, but you're using a fairly fine mist on the mechanism. Less is more. Take it really easy, and yeah, I haven't really had that problem.
Okay. And Al, if you wanted to tell us what the grit of the for the air eraser material.
Sure. Okay, so the AEX5 is the Pache part number description. It comes in two grits. 240 is the standard one, which I believe Jeff's been using. They do make a 400. And the beauty of the 400 is it is so fine that if you had a gloss paint finish that you didn't like, you can make it flat.
Oh, cool.
You can actually dust that 400 over a gloss finish, and it will abrade the surface, make it a nice flat surface without removing any paint.
Okay.
Yeah, I must be using the 240 because it would for sure just take the paint off.
Jake Swaney is asking air dryer, what method to use?
There's two ways. That at the compressor, which is where that's where the heat is, so that's where you get most of the condensation. So you would just use a moisture trap with usually they have a Schrader valve on the bottom so you can drain them. The other thing is you can get a desiccant dryer that's in line. there's one, I think that picture of the air eraser that was on there, that's actually an air eraser I've probably had as long as I've known you, Jerry. And it's got a desiccant dryer in line.
Okay.
A desiccant dryer is just basically something that sucks the air, blows through it, and it draws the moisture out of the
Draws
air.
the moisture out. Yeah.
So that's the most efficient way.
Okay. And Keith has commented that he has never had problems with shorts or electrical transfer in many models he's painted. He also runs power on board now, but of course that's a fairly recent innovation. He was painting models long before power on board came along. We're going to have to wrap it up here so we can move into our next segment. I want to thank Jeff and Al for a really excellent conversation and discussion about a topic that I know terrifies a lot of us. So once you get that beautiful brass model and we're going to put paint on it, oh no. So that's great. Thank you guys. And look forward to hearing more from you in the future and seeing some more pictures of those great models.